Okay.
Got Ben Thatcher here, Assistant City Manager.
Hey there.
Jim Blank, Assistant City Manager.
Sean Leonard, Compliance and Reporting Manager.
And that's it.
Wonderful. Well, great group. Thanks for everybody taking the time today. And we have Allison. Thanks for responding to the discussion there on the Knowledge Network. Um, I don't know how familiar you guys may be or may not be with some of the work that John and I have been doing in the Center for Priority-Based Budgeting, but just as a quick introduction, we have a larger process, the priority-based budgeting process. Actually, Plano, Texas has gone through it, through most of it in your
Yeah,
region.
we're familiar with that. I think we've seen the ICMA webinar on that.
Oh,
Oh,
good,
great.
good, good.
Yeah.
We were talking to somebody this morning and they hadn't had the background. So we just always like to start and make sure that background is there because what we've done is just a component, but we're finding that there's a real interest in how we're approaching one element of the process, which we think is on its own just very valuable, and that's establishing program inventory, looking at program costs, and as you can see, getting some detail about programs that even if you're not looking at a priority-based budgeting system, still could be of value as you're making some choices, as you're looking at other ways to prioritize programs, but certainly being sensitive to how much things cost. And as Chris is going to show you, even associate better ways to determine levels of program revenue, where it's appropriate to have program revenue. And so we're finding that this particular tool that when we were practitioners, we've been using for a long time, just kind of in Excel and by hand to come up with estimated costs and to improve our budgeting process, frankly. And then as we did work with some of these organizations, they needed a comprehensive tool that could actually be put in the hands of departments that they could help do some of the costing so it wouldn't fall on all of the finance. And being the finance guy, I'm glad to have other people help me do all these spreadsheets. That was very helpful. But then when we were brought in by Denver International Airport to actually help them develop program inventories and program costs, Chris went in and designed a much more integrated modeling technique, still using Excel, so it was easy to upload and download and manipulate the data, but so that it was a process that you could start from beginning to end and the different worksheets would feed each other and do some of the calculations because the airport truly needed to get a good handle on what were its programs and then how much do those programs cost. I'll just say before Chris really gets into the demonstration, our goal here is to follow more cost allocation principles than precise accounting. And you're thinking, okay, here's this finance director guy, and he's into doing all of these studies and all this analysis so that everything is exactly precise and on the money. I don't really subscribe to that for this particular reason and purpose because we're really just trying to get a good approximation so that we've got a good feel for what the costs are, knowing that circumstances year to year will cause things to vary. So we just want to get something that's a good estimate, as accurate as we can, but we're not looking for the precision that perhaps a costing study might put into place, but something that gives us a reasonable assurance that we have fairly accurate costs reflecting on the program, and so it doesn't become a major task within itself just to figure out how much a program costs, that this is kind of a straightforward way that shouldn't take more than a couple weeks for everyone to help complete.
Well, and I'll just give you some background. We've spent the last couple of years doing some cost analysis on some pilot programs that we've identified. So, and I'll tell you that we have things built into our model, such as like indirect charges and stuff. So I'm not so much concerned that it's not going to tie directly to exact numbers in our financial system because we know that we've got some things built into what we've been using that are some assumptions.
Fantastic.
And let me back up. We always make sure that it does tie to the budget or to the actuals. It's just that we don't worry about, are we $2 off on this program and $2 high in another program. We do reconcile it all back to a source document in some kind. It's just that when we get into the allocation of the cost of the programs, we're less worried about that precision at that level, as long as we're tying it back to a source document, so we've got that integrity of the data.
Excellent.
All right. Well, why don't we get into it? We'll walk you through how the tool works and the basic logic of it. There are three main steps to complete. And as we go along, just definitely feel free to interrupt us along the way and ask questions so that you have a good understanding of the model at the end. And we can kind of come together at the end of this and demonstrate the summary and talk more about how you might use it. But what you're looking at right now, and we'll go back and forth between two different versions or two different models that the city of Wheat Ridge, Colorado used and the city of Chandler, Arizona used, because they're slightly different, and we want to highlight some of the different functionality. While the basic model walks through these three steps the exact same way, you actually have a tremendous amount of flexibility in customizing some of the data to pull specific information. We'll show you what we mean. So in the first step, and here's City of Wheat Ridge, Colorado, and the example comes from their patrol division in the police department. The idea of the first step is that we're going to try and identify all of their staff by position, and you can either identify every single FTE in the division, or if you wanted to roll it up at a higher level, if you had a job class or a category that made more sense, you have the flexibility to do that too. Here in Wheat Ridge, they've gone ahead and identified all of the different FTE that serve the patrol division, as you see here. And up in this row, these are all of the personnel-related costs. So we have salaries and wages and all the various benefits that go along with providing for these various positions. And the idea is that we're going to develop fully loaded personnel costs. I'm sure you get the concept of that pretty easily. But it allows you to take from the line item budget all of those personnel-related costs and either associate them directly to the position if you know that these costs belong. Here is the exact salary for the police commander or a specific lieutenant, or you can actually do an allocation if you have certain benefits that actually depend on a percentage of salary, or if a particular benefit is divided up by FTE. You have some basic allocation methods, some general automation built into the model. So here in Wheat Ridge, you see they've gone through all of the salaries, wages, and all the various benefits. And by each of these FTE, we are generating a fully loaded personnel cost. So if you can see how that works, we've now transitioned every one of these positions now has a full cost. I'm going to show you, here's the city of Chandler, Arizona, and it's that exact same first step. One of the things that they were very interested in this particular exercise for was not just identifying programs and program costs, but they had specific workforce information, specific HR-related data that they knew about their employees, and they wanted to be able to use this at the end of this process. Now, Chandler also went through the entire priority-based budgeting process with us, and as you probably learned from the webinar, at the end of that, we understand programs and their overall priority based on how those programs influence results. Well, in Chandler's mind, it was going to make a difference to them. They had vacant positions, so actual positions left vacant. They had certain FTE that were nearing retirement, and then they had other FTE that were actually eligible for retirement but still working. And so they wanted to somehow come up with a way to incorporate that data. So we have the ability in the model to tag employees with certain pieces of information. In Chandler's case, we could tag the position as vacant. We could tag the position as an employee nearing retirement, or we could tag the position as an employee actually eligible for retirement. And so think about that at the end of their work, they're going to be able to understand actually the personnel and personnel costs related to vacant positions. And as they approach the budget process, maybe they don't fill a vacancy in a program that ends up being a lower priority overall from the process. Whereas if they had a program that was of a high priority and they had a vacancy or they had a retirement eligible position, now they're far more interested in gearing their succession planning towards filling those positions that belong to a higher priority program. So you can start to see with this additional data, if we can tag employees with pertinent information that's important to you, when we get to the end of this process, it all becomes useful. You have new insights besides just the program inventory and those program costs. Another thing that Chandler incorporated was this idea of, they call it job class, but the concept was they wanted to know the type of skills required for a certain position, whether it was a professional position that required specialized education or a degree, and so they labeled that with a P, or if it was more a clerical or administrative function. And the reason that they wanted to tag their employees and therefore their programs with this data is they wanted that big picture perspective at the end to understand, where do we have these clerical type functions across our organization, across programs and across departments, because they wanted to open up the dialogue. Is there a chance that we can start to consolidate some of these functions? Maybe have a shared clerical staff member supporting multiple programs, or actually supporting programs across departmental lines. So to the extent that we can associate this information or tag employees with this data during this step one, it will flow through the rest of the model, so that even if you just end up with programs and program costs, you'll have all of that information ready. So that's the basic idea for step one. And so now we have this information about each particular employee. And as we were talking about, if it's actually easier, you can identify, say you had 400 patrol officers, you can roll those all together in one group. If you didn't want to identify each individual FTE and didn't have the reason necessarily to tag them with particular data, you could treat them as a job class and go through this exact same allocation exercise.
And just as a side note, one of the reasons that when Chris and I were working in Jefferson County, the largest county in Colorado, we were trying to figure out when we got there how we were going to deal with the recession impact that was facing them. And one of the reasons that we started this work was we were really looking at some of the things that they did in their budgeting. And one of the things that they did not do well was really make sure that their budgeting for salaries and benefits was precise enough to really have budgets and actuals in alignment. And so this became just a critical tool that we used to ensure that as we were budgeting, we were eliminating some of the kind of drastic variances we were experiencing. Even before we got to a program level, it became a really handy tool. And for Jefferson County, we eliminated about $4 million in favorable variances, which was good because our budget was just way too high, and we were making potentially some difficult choices about cutting, when in fact a lot of the problem that they were experiencing was in the past. They just hadn't been precise. And since this represents 65 to 70% of the budget, we felt like this was a good place to really start to get more precision in our budgeting. But then as we started to get into the program inventory and program costing, we realized that also by doing this exercise, we had about 65 or 70% of our program costs easily identified, as Chris describes the next step of how we take this particular information and really translate it to the program level.
So for each position that we've identified in the first step, as we move to the second step, those positions now exist up in this realm. And so they're carried over directly. And again, each of these FTE now have their fully loaded personnel costs associated with them. And over here now we enter that discussion of what are the programs that these FTE help support. So here in Chandler, in their Transportation and Development Department, the Planning Division, they've identified 3 programs: current long-range planning, site development, plan review and inspection, and civil engineering. These other fields are just available for as many programs as this particular division might provide. And the idea here for step 2 is to take each of these positions and allocate their time. Generally divide them up over all of the different programs that they support, not just associate them with one program or another program, but to actually say this planning administrator actually is divvied up almost one-third, one-third, one-third at a reasonable level to all three of these programs that are offered within the division. So it's a pretty simple step. Again, the main idea, as John was just describing, is if we know how these particular staff support the programs, we can then allocate their fully loaded personnel to those programs, and we now have a major chunk of the program costs already identified because we have the personnel costs already understood. In Douglas County, Nevada, one of the interesting things that they're working on is they've gone through some tough times dealing with the budget. They've actually turned to a high degree of volunteerism in the county. And so one of the things they were really interested in this approach was identifying volunteer staff, essentially, determining what they would be equivalent to in terms of a full-time FTE. Are they working 40 hours a week? Of course not. So is a staff member at a 0.5 FTE? And then they can go through and consider them just like we're considering, sorry about that. Got an update going on. These actual paid FTEs, they have their volunteer positions who also support programs. And so fast forward, you can imagine at the end of the process, they'll have the real costs, the real personnel costs for these programs, but and the FTE associated with them. And they'll also have the volunteer equivalent FTE associated with the program, which is really critical, especially as they start to look at other ways they might provide a program. Is it actually going to be cost effective to outsource a program? They wanted to capture all the ways that their program is supported.
And I think what we found in those organizations that are starting to go down the volunteer path, that's really wonderful. It does provide some cost savings and some great ways to involve the community, but to lose sight of how much does this program really need in terms of dollars to support it if we didn't have the volunteers, keeping track of that seems to be reasonable, so that if, for example, something changes, the demographics change, or your volunteer base all of a sudden starts to deteriorate, you're going to know to continue this program. We kind of have an idea of what that cost will be. As Chris also pointed out, this really helps us when people are starting to have the demand of, as we hear from elected officials a lot, well, why don't we just outsource it? We need to do the analysis to see, well, is that a good decision? Will it really save us dollars? Especially since if you outsource it, those private sector companies still have a profit motive, which we in local government don't build into those costs. This is a good way to have the basis to do that fair analysis of whether or not it truly is cheaper for us to outsource this particular service. And this gives us the data to prepare that study and feel confident that we're comparing apples to apples when we're determining, is this really cheaper if the outsourcing question comes up.
All right. So in the third step, now that we have all of the actual FTE allocated towards the programs, and just so you know, even if the staff member believes that they work the job of 3 qualified FTE and they're overworked and underpaid, they can still only allocate 100% of their time. Now we have all personnel costs accounted for at a program level. The third step then is to simply take the remaining line items in the budget and go through a reasonable process of allocating those costs as well. So here, back in Chandler, it's step 3, and we have those exact same 3 programs. And up here, you see the remaining line items in their budget. So again, the benefit of the process is we're making that translation from a line item budget to an actual program budget. And you see for each of these cost centers, we have some automation built into the model again to allow for some a couple of various reasonable allocation methodologies. One being maybe the best thing to do for this cost center is to divide evenly by FTE. And so what that does is it references what just took place in step 2, and it says how many FTE do we actually have supporting this program compared to all the programs in the division, and it divides that cost. We have allocate dollars directly to program because, whoops, you guys still there? Hello? we'll take a break here. Yeah. Hello. I'm going to try and do a chat. Oh, okay. I agree.
Hi. I don't know what happened. The phone just hung up.
Oh, no problem. How remind us approximately where you left off.
You were talking about how the FTE costs can be divided.
Oh, great. We didn't lose that much.
No.
Well, sorry about that, and thanks for jumping back on. Yeah, what we were describing is that for all of the remaining line items, we can go through an allocation process, just like John was describing a reasonable cost allocation methodology, where some of the automation we have built in is to possibly divide the costs evenly by FTE. If you have specific information that the actual costs that you're talking about, say these operating supplies aren't divided evenly by FTE, but actually they belong to one specific program, you can choose allocate those costs directly to the program, and so this all zeroes out, and you just go in and enter in those costs. We also leave room for some of those cost centers where it's not clear the best methodology, and we want to have a discussion. As John and I work with organizations to help coach them through this process, sometimes you do run across a particular cost that it doesn't make sense to divide it by FTE. Allocating the dollars directly to the program, we're also not sure that makes sense. And typically what we find is this is a line item, this is a cost center that no one's quite sure how they've done the budget for this before. They have a number, they might be adding to it year to year, but there isn't a great degree of confidence of where that number comes from. And so that's a great discussion to say, well, what is it, and how do we actually divide it up amongst the programs?
I think this is where some of the discussions, as this tool can kind of be used to help build budgets as well, because when you're thinking about our office supply budget, we just kind of set that number and it seems reasonable. Do we compare the per capita office supplies in one department with another department and come up with a more reasonable allocation to understand why do the office supplies in this department at a per capita basis seem so much higher than another department? Why is travel per employee higher in one department than another? We can really start exploring these, or start looking at programs and saying, well, I know we probably do need some office supplies in this program, but for this program, we probably need minimal. So it also could be a way to reverse build the budget at a program level and then roll those up so that you can create your traditional line item budget. So not only do we see organizations using this tool to flip from a line item budget to a program budget, but also vice versa to help kind of build program budgets using that information that they have about the program itself, and then flipping that and creating their line item budget for the things that have to do with especially non-personnel matters. And so I think that's where it's been interesting to watch different organizations find different ways to adapt this to the practices that they need in terms of going either from line item to program or vice versa from program to line item.
Allison, as you described what you are currently doing in some of your pilot programs for indirect costs, this is exactly where they would come into play as well. If you knew exactly what the allocation was to the division or to the department or to the actual program based on your methodology for allocating those indirect costs, you can associate it directly with the programs here, or you can give the line item for the total amount allocated to a department or a division and walk through the appropriate methodology to make sure that we capture those indirect costs. So with those 3 steps, we come to the summary page, and this is the page that just pulls all the information together. And so we see our programs again. We see the total program costs. You'll see a series of checkpoints up towards the top. We built these in because John, being the expert accountant, made us come up with 2 different ways to come up to these totals to make sure, kind of full circle to what he was describing earlier in the presentation, to make sure that we're not missing any costs, that we did the allocation appropriately, and that from 2 different angles, we actually have tied out the budget. So we have the total program costs. We have now the total number of FTE. Check this out. We have this final column here for program revenue. And this is a really important concept. And we described it a little bit in the response on the Knowledge Network. But this idea that some of your programs have a user fee or a charge for service. And while we found that in most departments that have these fees, these charges, these program revenues, they do a good job at a department level. When we've broken this out to get to the program level, we find that it's an interesting exercise, to say the least, that the program revenues generated for certain programs we're finding are not based on the cost of that program. And so we have come across in Mission Viejo, California, for example, a tennis lessons program that was based on its charges for that tennis lessons program, bringing in more money than what it actually costs to provide the program based on this cost methodology. And that raises some issues. Okay, this is a profitable program. What happens to the excess revenue? Well, they're using it to subsidize some of the other programs in Parks and Rec. So that's an interesting discussion. Is that what they intend to do? Do the people paying for the tennis lessons know that they're actually subsidizing the rates to the rec center or to some of the other athletics programs? And then furthermore, once they get into prioritization, the question becomes all more interesting. What if we have lower priority programs whose costs are being subsidized? Some of these programs might even be in competition with other private sector businesses in our community. It's great data to have this insight at the program level. So we have program cost, number of FTE. We can now have that discussion of program revenue and evaluate if our fees and charges are set appropriately. And then as we move further down the line, you see, and this is back to Chandler, Arizona, because they've tagged their employees with this data relating to the vacancies, relating to employees nearing retirement or retirement eligible, we can also break those costs out. So you see here, they have their costs associated with personnel, the remaining operating costs, costs associated with vacancies, costs associated with those retirement eligible personnel, and then the actual FTE numbers that correspond with those specific FTEs that met those characteristics. So you can think about it in your own situation. If this data would be of interest, would you actually want to have this information? It would lead to better decision making as you gear up your succession planning, as you look towards vacant positions and whether or not to fill them. All of this can be customized and built into the model. And then we'll also add that if vacancies or retirement eligible characteristics weren't that important, if you had other pieces of information you wanted to capture, the model is set up with that flexibility that we can build those in, as long as we can tag the employees. So I think with that, that's kind of the orientation of the tool and how it works and what you end up with. But we'd love to take you, if you had some questions or wanted to discuss how you might use it, that we just want to make the most value of the time with you.
I actually had a question about the inventory. You know, I understand the tool, and I mean, it's kind of similar to how we've gone through our thought process. I think it's maybe a little bit better organized than what we're doing now. But the step before you start loading in costs, I mean, how do you even get to where you identify all your programs?
You know, that's really been an interesting process for us as we've gone into organizations. It's the one that everybody says, I don't know how we would start. And what we do is we kind of approach it with, let's just think about what do people do. And so in some organizations, they start with the idea of, well, here are the employees. what are they spending their time doing, not at a task level, but at a program level. And one of the things that as we work with organizations on developing program inventories, obviously we've now accumulated a lot of information from other jurisdictions. And so we're able to kind of help them start that effort and then coach them through by reviewing what they've done. Does this seem right? Does this seem wrong? We have some rules of thumb that we try to apply. But what we find is that tasking the departments to just come up with your program inventory. We give them a short period of time. We give them about 2 weeks, 3 weeks at the most, and say, just spend some time, get some people in a room, and talk about what are the things you offer. We've got some, some criteria that we coach people through. For example, is there a fee? Well, if there's a fee, it's probably a standalone program. Is there something in the city code that says we have to do this particular this thing? Well, that's probably a standalone program. We know that we're trying to get it so it's not too big, and that's probably the largest component of this. We're trying to get departments to really become a little more discreet so that the police don't just say, well, we do patrol and investigations. Well, what kind of investigations? Let's talk about the patrol. There's traffic patrol, there's neighborhood patrol, there's response to the emergency call. So based a lot on the fact that we've done this now with 30 organizations, we really kind of have a quick dialogue, let the departments do their first stab. We find that most of them can come up with about 80% of their program inventory just within a quick meeting. It's getting that last 20 refined that is difficult, but it isn't impossible. And we say we don't strive for perfection. We strive to get what seems reasonable. And then by applying the FTE, then they can see, oh, did we miss something? Oops, we haven't accounted for all of Joe's time. So what else does he do? Or, boy, this is getting into minutia. We've only got a 0.0025 FTE. That program's too small. But on the other hand, we've allocated 9 of our 10 positions to one program. That's probably too big. And so we really kind of have a back and forth coaching on let's get this program inventory right, but realize that it's going to be iterative and maybe set a goal that in the next 2 or 3 years, we're going to keep refining and refining till we have a pretty good feel. But that's where I think just kind of letting the departments make the list, kind of coaching them a little bit against, let's not get this task. So email is not a program. We don't offer that so that, a standalone, it's a task within a program. But we think in terms of there are 2 types of program. There's our community programs, what we offer to the citizens, and then what we call our governance programs, what we offer internally to help support the organization. So revenue forecasting becomes a governance program that we offer internally. Building inspection becomes an external program that we offer to the community or to support the community. And so it's refining it back and forth to get it down to a reasonable level of granularity. If you've got 4 programs, that's probably not going to be enough because that just says we spend 25% of our time or 25% of our budget on each of these programs. We see that most organizations will end up, a good size organization is probably going to have 350 programs. Smaller organizations still come up about 300. When we finished the work in Cincinnati, Ohio, it was over 600 programs. But you would expect that. And I think that the success is we've got to get down to a level of granularity that helps us make better decisions, but not too small where we're dealing with insignificant dollar amounts or insignificant FTE allocations, which is where this particular tool helps us test, are we still too big? Are we still too small in terms of at least the number of FTE that we associate it. Some organizations, when they do this, will start and they'll say, let's take our employees or at least our positions. So if we've got, police officers, can we come up with a discussion? What on a percentage basis do these police officers do during the course of a budget, how much time, and we start breaking it down that way to back into that. Or some organizations just start listing what they know their programs are. Many times, just going to their website of the department itself lists a lot of the programs. And then, of course, as we coach organizations, we've got kind of examples from so many other entities that say, here are the program inventories, and just start looking at this and saying, do you do this? Do you do this? Do you do something similar? And that's how we really help them develop it. The goal is we don't want this to take a lot of time. We don't want this to be a labor intensive process. We just want people to dedicate over 3 weeks, about 40 hours at most, to just have discussions and say, let's plan what we're going to do. Most of them find out it takes them a lot less time than what they originally think, because they're just starting to figure out, well, I know what we do. This probably seems big. This seems small. And then Chris and I just kind of help fine tune them when we're working with them on the priority-based budgeting process.
With regard to, that's sort of like the drilling down process. We operate under a strategic management system here. We use a balanced scorecard system.
Uh-huh.
And if we wanted to also incorporate something in the tool that could roll up to, like we've got these smaller programs, but we all, as part of our strategic management system, we have focus areas that the council has defined are the areas that are important, such as safety and security, mobility, infrastructure, stuff like that. So is there a way to tag a program and say, this is a safety and security program, and then run an analysis at the end that shows us on those broad scales where we're dedicating our money to?
You got it. So we would be able to tag that with no problem. The program would have a focus area, and then we can roll up focus areas and filter those because they would all have a unique characteristic.
Oh, yeah, and the city of Cincinnati had something similar where they started. They did have broader categories, and they called those programs, and then they broke them down into the services within those programs. So as long as we've got Excel capabilities, that's something that is easily done. And if you kind of recall from our priority-based budgeting workshops, we're really trying to get programs associated with these kind of focus areas of results. Although what we find in most of our work, some of the programs actually could easily be associated with more than one focus area, which is the basis of how we do the prioritization process, is we let them be attributable to more than one of these areas, if that seems logical. But in the case of just having that program identified in some classification manner, it's easy to do, and then be able to use the Excel capabilities to sort that and roll those up.
So you can imagine it. I mean, you could, by doing it this way, you would also have FTE by focus area, personnel costs, operating costs, and indirect costs by focus area. If you can, it would roll up the exact same way, which would be pretty phenomenal to tie into your system.
Don't have any questions? So how does this work? I mean, what is the process for going forward? Do you guys provide us a proposal, or?
I mean, we could certainly do that, finding out a little bit more about what you're interested in. If you're interested in just incorporating the tool, having it customized, if you're interested in some support in developing program inventories, maybe just kind of after you've all had a chance to visit, either give us a call or outline in an email kind of the approach you'd like to take, and then we'd be glad to put something together just to meet those needs.
Okay.
Just for a high level order of magnitude, just so we're clear with you as well, for organizations like Cincinnati, where we go through the entirety of the priority-based budgeting process, where we're helping your council identify results, there's result definitions that come with the results. We enter into this step where we're helping identify the programs, develop a program inventory, do all the costing, then move into program scoring and peer review and ultimately the development of the resource alignment diagnostic model, which you probably remember from the webinar. Our range of prices for the entire priority-based budgeting process is somewhere in the $30,000 to $40,000 range. When we started to find out that organizations were interested in this specific step, it will depend a little bit on, just as John was saying, exactly how you want us to help and the amount of customization. If you want us to help the departments actually go through it and provide that training on what is a program inventory and how that works, we're thinking in the $4,000 to $6,000 range, roughly, just so you have that order of magnitude in your head.
Perfect.
So great.
So we'll kind of talk about it here. I don't see us doing the full-blown, from beginning to end, because we've sort of gone through that with our strategic management system and our touch points every year with council. So I think we sort of need to enter into the modeling, the cost modeling part. So probably would be looking at something on that smaller scale.
Okay.
But we'll probably need to sit down and talk about exactly how much support we think we'll need.
Right.
Where we've sort of stalled out with our program here is just sort of getting the wheels turning underneath it and getting the departments involved. So that may be something that we might enlist your aid with.
And I think that's where we want to be just flexible and have you kind of talk about where we can offer that support, and then we can talk about that pricing structure. But I think you've got a good feel for the ballpark amounts that we would be talking.
Right.
Well,
and I will get back with you within the next week or so.
That'll be wonderful. And we just appreciate your interest and taking the time to look at what we're doing. We always love to share the results of our work, and we'd be excited to help in any way we can.
Thank you so much. We appreciate it.
You're welcome. Have a good day.
Take care, guys.
Bye.